the Southland, 1 week at a time. SCV chat starts now.
It's Monday o'clock. It's Monday o'clock. Wow, that sums up the week, doesn't it? It's 7 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, so you know what time it is. It is time for your weekly episode of SCV Chat. Before we get started, please remember, the views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily the views and opinions of the SCV, its GEC, nor in Divisions, Brigade, Camps, or any of the subsidiaries. How is everybody doing in Dixieland tonight? We have deemed him the SCV Chat historian, Michael C. Hardy, on tonight. I got to talk nice about him while he's not on, or he's going to try to refute me. But it's always good to have Mr. Hardy on. And, of course, tonight we are celebrating Jackson's 200th birthday. Yesterday was General Stonewall Jackson's 200th birthday. And I personally hope to see a couple more events pop up for General Jackson. I know Lee Jackson banquets happening right now across our Confederation, but selfishly, I would like to see specific events celebrating General Jackson's 200th birthday. You only turn 200 once, people. So I think it'd be a great year to honor General Jackson all year long. So I hope to see that this sparks something bigger, and I hope to see some people doing some General Jackson 200th birthday celebrations all year long. Whew. All right, let's greet everybody. I have some quick news, and we're going to jump right into Mr. Hardy's General Jackson presentation, because I know I'm looking forward to it. And so I do want to thank Mr. Hardy for coming on. I text him, not last minute this time. That's very rare for me not to text poor Michael C. Hardy like 2 days before the show. He's usually always game to come on and talk some history. So I like to give him a lot of thanks, because a lot of times in this show's history, he'll get a text like 2 days before a show, or one day, the day of a show. I was like, hey, do you want to come on? I texted him last Monday after we did our Lee Jackson episode, and something was just clicking in me and wanting me to do something for General Jackson's 200th birthday. And I wanted a specific episode. And so I talked to Mr. Hardy, and Mr. Hardy agreed to come on. And I cannot thank him enough for that. Again, everybody say nice things while he's not on, so he can't deny it. But yeah, Mr. Hardy is a great man and a great historian. I thank him for all his hard work he's done in the subject of history and defending our history and preserving our history. We need good historians now more than ever to make sure our history gets preserved to the next generation. But let's do a quick hello, Mr. Ryan Rogers from Camp 1824, Mr. John from Camp 1388, Gerald from the Sam Davis Camp 596. I hope you all had a great Lee Jackson banquet. Hate that I missed it. As everybody knows, I'm taking care of a cow named Roscoe P. Coltrane, my little baby calf that I named after a Dukes of Hazzard character. So he's been a handful. So looks like I'm not going to be going to a lot of events for a while. Mr. Rick, good to see you from Camp 1302. Miss Linda, Mr. Roy from Camp 1387 out of Florida. Keith from Camp 1209. Mr. Frank, Mr. Bobby, Mr. Al. Kentucky Division Commander Kyle Thompson. Mr. Robert, the one and only Michael C. Hardy is on tonight. That's correct. Mr. John, good to see you. Thank you, by the way. I do hope it catches on, and I see a lot of General Jackson events. The Turner Ashby Camp from Virginia checking in. Good to see you, Jason. Good to see Virginia in the chat. David, good to see you. Our Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief, Walter D. Donnie Kennedy. Good to see you, sir. It sounds like you had a great event. Mr. Thomas, Mr. Tony, Mr. Sean, the Florida man in the house. Good to see you, brother. And we all continue to pray for you and your family. You mean the world to us here at the SCV Chat team, and we are so happy you joined our family. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to call. Mr. Donald, and Camp 584 in the chat, and Camp 31 in the chat. Look at that. All right. So real quick, a quick announcement about the pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is coming up May 4th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Commander Boshiers has announced our keynote speaker is the President General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Miss Jenny, President General Jenny. I want to thank her for coming up to our lovely headquarters at Elm Springs to be our keynote speaker, and I cannot wait to hear her speak, and of course, all the other things that the pilgrimage has in store for us. So, without further ado, with that quick announcement, I want to welcome on our guest speaker for tonight, historian, Mr. Michael C. Hardy.
Good evening. How are you doing? How are things in Mississippi?
Cold, very
cold.
cold.
Boy, I hear that. It's not much better here in Western North Carolina. We finally got above freezing today, like just barely above freezing. So it's been with about 6 or 7 inches of snow the past week. It's been fun. I haven't been any place, but some people have been out having a lot of fun. But yeah, it's great to be back on. And I'm looking forward to talking about Jackson tonight. And hey, if you your camp needs someone to come talk about Jackson and you're in my little realm or sphere, drop me a note and I would love to come and chat. I will actually be at the Mosby camp tomorrow night in Kingsport, Tennessee. And I will be at the Vance camp in Asheville, North Carolina this Thursday night. If you're interested, drop me a note and we'll see what we can do. I don't think I'm going to get to Texas this year, but who knows what's going to happen. I thought, yeah, and you're right. You did give me a week this time. There have been at least one occasion where it's been like 2 hours before we went live, and it was like, okay, I think I can do that. But yeah, you did give me a week. And I thought long and hard about, what can we do about Jackson? I don't want to just sit here and give you the same information that you can go to Wikipedia or some other place. I don't like Wikipedia, but that you can go to Wikipedia and find. I wanted to do something a little different. And we're actually going to talk about 3 or 4 different points, depending on how you divide them up this evening. Three or 4 things about his life, about Jackson's life that you may not know or might not have heard, or may slightly contradict some of the things that you have heard in the past. And everything that I'm going to tell you tonight, I can back up, and most of it comes from the men that served with Jackson. Now, if you want, and I would be remiss if I didn't do this, and we're going to do it right off at the start. If you want to learn more about Jackson, go get James I. Robertson Jr.'s biography, Stonewall Jackson, the Man, the Myth, and the Legend. There are a lot of Jackson books out there. I actually pulled all my Jackson books off the shelf, but this is my favorite. This is one of the best out there, and I encourage you, if you want to know about Jackson, it's a nice, big, fat, thick book. So go check it out. And if you want to talk about other books or other things, drop that in the comments, and we can do that here in a few minutes. But I pulled out some stories and some things I've researched in the past. Now, I've never written directly about Jackson, but Jackson has appeared, in my history of the 37th North Carolina, and my history of the Branch Lane Brigade, and my history of the 39th Battalion Virginia Cavalry. So Jackson and I have, a kind of this relationship going on here. So, I've researched him quite a bit in my life, and I've come across a lot of great stories. And we're going to start with one. Harrison, I don't know if you've read a lot of Shakespeare in your life.
In high school, I read a bit of Shakespeare.
Okay, well, in Henry V, good King Henry ditches his clothes and puts on an old cloak and goes out and walks among his soldiers on the eve of battle. And in this disguise, he asks their thoughts on victory and their thoughts on if they're going to survive the battle. And so I wonder, do you think Jackson ever did that?
I haven't heard any stories of that, but it wouldn't shock me if he did.
I have been able to dig out a few stories along those lines. Now, I think one of the most important things to remember is that a lot of times generals are not always accessible to their men. Their staff officers try and keep them away from the hustle and bustle. You know, you're not going to be able to go up to Jackson's tent and sit down and say, "Hey, General Jackson, how's it going this evening? What do you think about that battle the other day?" Or, you know, so forth and so on. And that's on purpose. And a lot of times when you're reading letters and diaries, anytime the men see Jackson, they're excited. They want to cheer. They do cheer. If we think back to Chancellorsville, then, you know, Jackson, as they're on that march around the federal flank, Jackson is saying, "Don't cheer." It's going down the line. "Don't cheer Jackson. Don't cheer Jackson." You know, we don't want the Federals to know that we're out there. So don't cheer Jackson. So, you know, the staff officer a lot of the time tried to keep the men away from Jackson. But there's a few stories I've been able to dig out. I was in the Library of Virginia one time working on the book on the 39th Battalion Virginia Cavalry, and I came across this story. Confederate soldier was sitting in the rain with his compatriots. It's night. They're gazing at this house with light streaming through the windows. And the soldier said something to the effect of, "I wish I was a general and out of the rain." And out of the darkness, another voice came, "Boys, Jackson is right here with you." Now, I can't say that's a true story or not. That's the way that a soldier remembered it, and the story that he passed down. There's another story. This one is actually from a Union soldier. This actually is wartime, appeared in the New York Times on September 8th, 1862. There's this Federal soldier, and he's been captured, and he sees this group, a motley group of human beings, gaunt in their appearance. This is what he's writing, the soldier's writing, ill-armed and clad, who eagerly questioned all who would listen to them about the affairs of the government. And among the number was the guerrilla chief Jackson, disguised in the clothing of a private soldier. This was not the first disguise Jackson had donned for while returning toward Richmond from the pursuit of General Banks. And at the time when he expected to be cut off by General Shields, Jackson had disguised himself in citizen's attire and actually performed the duties of a wagon master for several days to avoid being recognized if taken prisoner. Nearly all of the rebel officers present wore the uniforms of private soldiers with no mark or whatever rank whatsoever to show them. To show what they were. And I think there's a lot to unpack with this story. We know, looking at surviving uniforms, that, you know, there were a lot of officers who ditched, you know, the fancy coats with all the chicken guts, Austrian knots on the sleeves, and, you know, basically wore a private's blouse or uniform or coat, or depot coat. It was functional. And I don't necessarily want to say it was a disguise, but it was much more functional than having the full dress coat. And, you know, your full dress coat would be back in the wagon or someplace. And if you think about it, you know, A.P. Hill has his famous red battle shirt. Robert E. Lee wore a colonel's uniform. Brian Grimes has a coat with no rank on it at all. So, you know, there's a lot to that. Those simple fabric saving jackets that were more comfortable and everything. But the part of this story I disagree with a little bit is, sure, Jackson may have worked with the Teamsters, but Jackson was not a very good horseman. He is not Lee. He's not Grant. I mean, Grant loved horses, just absolutely loved horses. If you see a description of Jackson on a horse, a lot of times people thought he was drunk because he would kind of ride tilted to one side and it looked like he was going to fall off at any moment. You know, he did not have the skills on a horse that Lee had. So I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but once again, that's a story from September of 1862. So we put a lot more credence to the stories that happen in those time periods. There's another story out there of Jackson donning other clothes and walking into a federal camp. There's a story out there from a hospital matron near Frederick, Maryland. She reported being visited by a civilian who had a very keen eye and looked at everything and took everything in. And she checked on the guy, and he was reported to be Dr. George, a veteran of the Crimean War. But she actually believed that Dr. George was really Stonewall Jackson, who often went into the federal camps to, as she said, to acquaint himself with what's going on. And it could be that maybe sometimes people misunderstood Jackson's shabby dress for a civilian. Of course, we know that Jackson wore his blue VMI coat fighting at the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run. We know that. We also know that, you know, Jackson didn't really get a real nice coat until Jeb Stuart gave it to him. And so maybe people are looking at Stewart or Pickett. And actually Jackson and Pickett graduated in the same class at West Point together, along with George B. McClellan. But maybe people are looking at Stewart or Pickett or some of these other generals and comparing them with Jackson and saying, hey, you know, Jackson, he's not the best dresser in the world. He couldn't ride a horse very well. He definitely couldn't teach. I mean, you know, there are plenty of stories out there of him being probably one of the worst teachers that VMI ever had. And had it not been for the war, we probably never would have heard of Thomas Jonathan Jackson. He just would have been an instructor at, you know, a West Point grad, Mexican War veteran, and instructor at the Virginia Military Institute, and not even a footnote there in history. But the war came along and his genius really showed itself at that point in time. So that's my first point about Jackson. Maybe he just did, you know, wander around camp dressed as a civilian and just to gauge, like Henry V did, just to gauge the feelings of his men. That's an interesting thought. So point number 2 tonight in the life of Jackson, as we remember his 200th birthday, deals with food. Actually, I have a whole book coming out, not just on Jackson and food. One of these days, my book, Feeding the Army of Northern Virginia, will hit the newsstands. Hopefully this spring. We'll have to wait and see about that. Jackson and Lee would have been a lot different when it comes to culinary taste. Lee, while not wealthy, was one of the first families of Virginia. Lee living there in Alexandria most of his childhood, not all, but most of his childhood there. Jackson's dad died when he was 1, and his mom died, or no, Jackson's dad dies and one of his sisters dies when he's like 3 years old. And Jackson, after his mom remarries, his stepdad does not like his stepkids. And so Jackson is kind of bounced around between uncles and aunts, and he lives with his grandmother for a while. And so the table where Jackson is sitting is different than the table where Lee is sitting, because they would be a different socioeconomic class. But Jackson discovers early on that he is what he calls a dyspeptic. We today would probably say that he had irritable bowel syndrome. There were a lot of things that he just could not eat because it made him ill. And there are a lot of stories about that from Jackson's staff, that small group of people that lived with Jackson on a daily basis. And Henry Kidd Douglas is one of those staff officers who talks quite a bit about food and Jackson and what he couldn't eat and what he did eat. And at one point, Henry Kidd Douglas says, quote, "I knew him to make a very hearty dinner of raspberries, milk, and bread. He was therefore at times a great disappointment to hospitable housewives, who, after skillfully providing various handiworks of choice foods for his enjoyment, looked on regretfully when Jackson selected one or two simple things and declined all of the rest. He did not accept invitations to dinner when he could politely avoid it, and the majority of those he went to, he was led into by members of his staff who did not believe that good food affected their official usefulness. They felt compelled at times to accept invitations, and they induced him to go in order not to seem unappreciative of the courtesy." That's Jackson. I dug out one story one time of Jackson. One of his aides, his couriers, is sitting on a horse behind Jackson, and this lady comes up with this basket of food, and Jackson, of course, goes through it, finds a couple of things, and then sends her away. And the staff or the aide actually says, "I was so hungry, I would have loved anything out of that basket." And Jackson was so focused on the task at hand that he never thought about turning around and saying, "Hey, do you want something as well?" That he was just absolutely so focused on that. And it's Henry Kidd Douglas that tells us that Jackson asked him one time. Douglas asked Jackson one time why he was so simple in his diet, and Douglas replied that Jackson said he'd been a dyspeptic for nearly 20 years, and that it had caused him great suffering in body and mind, and they had never forgotten its horrors. He obviously had digestive issues, and so was able to regulate that by what he ate and what he did not eat. Now, you've probably heard the story, and many other folks have probably heard the story that Jackson was a teetotaler. And there's a very famous quote that he tells Douglas. He says, "In that I differ with you and most men. I like the taste of all spirituous liquors. I can sip whiskey or brandy with a spoon, and with the same pleasure, the most delicious coffee or cordial. And if I'd indulged my appetite, I would have been a drunkard." Okay. Famous quote right there, right? This comes at, if you read the rest of the story, Jackson has just shocked his staff. He is being invited. They are positioned. They are, let's see, where are they? They're up near Shepherdstown in Williamsport, and they've been invited to dinner with a local farmer. And Douglas writes, "Before supper was announced, the hospitable host appeared with a decanter of whiskey and glasses, apologized for the state of the weather, and suggested that the general or some of his staff might be disposed to take an appetizer, either straight or with water. 'Have you any white sugar?' asked General Jackson, and instantly it was forthcoming. 'Come, gentlemen, let's take a drink,' with the gentleman's announcement. And the General Jackson walked to the table, and with the skill and ease which seemed in shocking contrast to his reputation, mixed a stiff toddy and drank it off. He set down the glass and was complimenting the host upon its flavor and purity, although not old. And then Jackson tells Douglas, I differ with most men. I can drink the liquor. If I'd pursued that, I would have been an alcoholic." So we get the second part of that story, but we don't usually get the first part of that story. And Douglas goes on in his book and talks about different occasions that, there would be a bottle of wine or something on the table, and every once in a while Jackson would get a glass of it or something. I know that's going to come as a shock to some people, but that's the men who lived with Jackson during the war. And so you can take it up with them. And once again, we can't we can't take things out of context. Sometimes we need to keep it and read the whole passage. I think my preacher preached about that recently at church. So like many other generals and ranking officers, Jackson actually had somebody to fix his food. Before he left Lexington, or not long after he left Lexington, he hired this slave by the name of Jim Lewis. And Lewis belonged to a man there in Lexington, Virginia. And Lewis just did an incredible job of not only fixing food that Jackson and his staff could eat, but going out and finding food. And I wrote a post about this several years ago. We have all of these camp servants and slaves. Some of them are brought from home. Some of them are hired. Some of them are freemen that are hired. And they just are given a pass and they roam all over the countryside looking for food. You know, we've got men in Orange Courthouse and Gordonsville that are sending their cooks back to Richmond to get food to bring back to their camp. And so that's not something we think a whole lot about. But that happened quite a bit. Jim Lewis actually went out and looked for food all the time and brought stuff in and cooked it. And did a remarkable job considering Jackson's, what would be a good word, proclivity for not eating a whole lot, you know, and being, you know, having those intestinal issues. Great story. This is August of 1862. Once again, Douglas Southall Freeman. It's July 4th, 1862. It's during the 7 Days Battle. And Jim Lewis has come into the room where the staff officers are sleeping and announced that breakfast was ready and that General Jackson was asking for the staff. Where are the staff at? And Douglas writes that, quote, I was up and dressed as if to catch a comet and met the general just coming from his room. He asked if the guides he had ordered to send out to General Ewell at daylight were gone and were told that they were still asleep. Jackson soon had them galloping on their way, breakfastless. Jackson's temper was beginning to show. He asked for the staff and they were not. And I was about to propose, this is Douglas speaking, that we breakfast without waiting, when the general turned to Jim Lewis quickly and ordered him to put everything in the wagon at once and have it on the road in 10 minutes, remarking, if my staff will not get up, then they will go without their breakfast. Let's ride. And Douglas adds, why, pray, should the general and I go without breakfast? What was the wisdom of that, suffering for our sins for the rest of the sleepy staff officers? Jim, however, obeyed the general with gravity. Jim Lewis had already had his breakfast. So just another one of those great stories that deal with a very small subject. Now, how about Jackson and Lemons? If you ever go to Jackson's grave there at the cemetery in Lexington, the monument is there and the grave is there and there's a fence around it and people put lemons in there for Jackson all the time. I can't think of a time I've ever been up there and not seen lemons there around his grave. And I think I saw someone post it earlier that Jackson's favorite fruit was actually peaches and not lemons. But Henry Kidd Douglas said that lemons were one of Jackson's favorite fruits. And he gives us this story. This is in Henry Kidd Douglas's book, I Rode with Stonewall. Douglas writes that it's during the Battle of Gaines' Mill, and Jackson could be seen sucking on a lemon throughout the day. Douglas writes, quote, immediately a small piece was bitten out of the lemon, and slowly Jackson began to extract its flavor and its juice. From that moment until darkness ended the battle, that lemon scarcely left his lips except to be used as a banton to emphasize an order. So, Jackson's not drawing his sword. In fact, if you know anything about the Battle of Cedar Mountain or Cedar Run there in Virginia, Jackson's sword actually rusted in the scabbard, and he couldn't get it out when he needed to try and rally his own brigade and his own men. But here's that lemon being used to direct the army. So I've often wondered, lemons were in short supply in the Confederacy. There were a few places you could get lemons, but they were in a short supply. How in the world did Jackson get lemons? And I finally came to this conclusion. During the 7 days, of course, the Federal Army under McClellan has abandoned its depot, its supply depot at Harrison's Landing, and has moved across the peninsula to another spot. And Hero von Bork actually writes that when Stuart and the cavalry get there, a lot of the supplies are being burned, but there are a lot of things that are not being burned, and they are able to rescue several crates of lemons. And so I believe that those lemons made their way from Stuart to Jackson. And that's where Jackson got that lemon. Now, there's another account. This article appeared in Confederate Veteran in 1912. Kind of a famous story. Some of y'all may have heard this about Jackson sucking on lemons during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. And someone asked Jackson, where did he get the lemons? And the answer was from his commissary. And the response was, our commissary hasn't got any lemons. And the reply was, old Jack got them from his other commissary. What other commissary? Banks. General Banks, as in the federal General Banks. Of course, that's Nathaniel Banks. And Jackson had captured Banks's commissary wagons. Just about every 2 or 3 days, he'd capture Banks' commissary wagons there for a while. And I'm sure that's where that lemon story came from as well. There are only a couple of other lemon stories. So I think the whole lemon idea is really based upon 2 or 3 accounts, and that those lemons came from the Federals and had been captured and appropriated for Jackson at that point in time. So one other story I want to leave for this evening, and then we can take questions. And Harrison, I'm interested in what your favorite Jackson story is, or something you'd like to know more about when we get done here. But did you know that during the war, the federal government banned books?
That sounds about right.
Well, they did. And they actually banned a Stonewall Jackson biography. It is May 2nd, 1864. We are in Lexington, Kentucky, and General Order number 39 has just been issued from the headquarters of the Department of Ohio. And that order says that the circulation of a book entitled Life, Services, and Campaigns of Stonewall Jackson from Official Papers, Contemporary Narratives, and Acquaintances by a Virginian is hereby deemed off limits within this command. Anyone found with copies of such a book in his possession, offering or intending them for sale, is either a traitor or one who loves money better than his country, and his right to the book is declared forfeited, and the same is ordered to be seized and destroyed by command of General Burbridge. By the way, Burbridge is one of the most hated federal generals of the war, but that's an entirely different conversation. We'll leave that one here for a few minutes. But there was a biography. John Eston Coke, a Virginia native, actually authored a biography. He was working on it before Jackson was killed. And he actually finished it about the time, several months, June. It was published in June of 1863, so about a month after Jackson had died. He publishes this book. Well, that book made its way up north, and a New York publisher, Charles B. Richardson, probably stole or pirated, plagiarized, but he stole the book and he published it. He released a copy with his imprint on it, A Life of Stonewall Jackson. And the New York Times actually advertised that the new volume would be ready on September 10th and that 10,000 copies had been ordered. So that book, advertisements for the sale of that book, appeared in newspapers in Burlington, Vermont, Alexandria, Virginia, which is under federal control, Evansville, Indiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Louisville, Kentucky, Chicago, Illinois, and that's all by the end of September. Are all these different newspapers and these companies, businesses advertising in these newspapers, saying that, hey, we've got this book. We think you should buy it. Come by and see us. So in Missouri, in March of 1864, federal agents had discovered Confederates distributing books, documents, and publications of all kinds. It's more than just the book, The Life of Stonewall Jackson, that's on that list. Pollard's Southern History of the War, which becomes Pollard's The Lost Cause after the war is over, printed in 1866. You can get that book. You can get official reports of the Confederate government up north. You can get Book of the Prophet of Stephen. You can get Abraham Africanus, The Mysteries of the White House. You can get the Lincoln Catechism, all stuff that Frank Powell should probably look into reprinting. Some really interesting stuff. So on March 31st, the federal provost marshal in St. Louis ordered the seizure of things like Pollard's Southern History of the War and official reports of the Confederate government, The Life of Stonewall Jackson, and a book called Morgan and His Men. We know in mid-May of 1864, soldiers visited publishing houses and bookstores of Kelly and Pyatt in Baltimore, Maryland. They seized the book. They seized photographs of Confederate generals. They seized playing cards of Confederate generals. Note paper bearing Confederate flags were seized there. And Baltimore, while it had a lot of Southern sympathizers, it was under federal control for the duration of the war. Did banning The Life of Stonewall Jackson actually stop people in the North from acquiring and reading the book? Not at all. Banning books almost always drives up interest and sales. Almost always. The book I found was still advertised for sale in both Lancaster, Pennsylvania and Maysville, Kentucky. And the Courier Journal in Louisville had an advertisement in September of 1864. This is after that order goes out, that agents were being sought to distribute the book. So you could go and get a dozen copies of the book and go out on the street and sell them. Cook is one of those interesting folks in the war. After the war is over, he's actually, I think it was a cousin to or brother-in-law. Y'all don't shoot me here. He was a first cousin to Jeb Stuart's wife. He actually reprints the book after the war. And then he also writes a book on Robert E. Lee and the Stonewall Brigade and numerous novels. The Federals were actually banning books and arresting people as the war went along. So, as King Solomon says in the Old Testament, there's nothing new under the sun. So those are just 4 little pieces, about Jackson food and Jackson visiting the soldiers, and Jackson and lemons and Jackson biography being banned during the war. Do y'all have any questions? Harrison, what's your favorite Stonewall Jackson story?
It's hard to narrow it down, but here's one that I just found. So most people from last Monday will remember I started reading The Great Partnership. And in the first couple of seconds of reading that, you hear this fantastic story. And I even posted this story on my SCV page and my author page. And it really sparks interest in me for some reason. I just love the story, and I couldn't help but not repost that. And I got it right here. I'm going to try to pull it up if Facebook will cooperate with me. And I probably could tell it from memory because I just read it last Monday, but I want to make sure I don't get any details wrong. But here's something that like sparked my interest. So on May 9th, 1863, General Jackson sent Reverend B.T. Lacey from his bedside to Army headquarters near Fredericksburg. And of course, we all know during this time, General Jackson is heavily injured. He's lost his arm, and they're trying to he's trying to heal. And I don't know, has it taken a turn yet? I can't remember how quickly his health.
He's very quickly heading in that direction. I mean, I mean, he only has a day to live.
Yeah.
So,
but you know, when I heard it, I asked myself, why would he send, you know, his preacher away? He's a very religious man. Surely he would want his preacher by his side. And I found it very, there's no other way than to say very Stonewall Jackson-ness,
right.
What he did. He sent Reverend B.T. Lacey to lead Sunday worship for the troops. Reverend Lacey didn't want to leave his friend, who was, of course, heavily injured, but General Jackson wanted him to look after the spirit of the men more. He wanted to make sure they were taken care of. They had their Sabbath. They had the spiritual needs that the Lord will give them. And so, and he didn't care how bad a shape he was. He basically not begged. I don't think he even commanded, if I'm not mistaken, but he just kept asking them. So Reverend Lacey went to the Army headquarters near Fredericksburg and led Sunday worship to about 1,800 soldiers and the Army commander, General Robert E. Lee. And of course, as we know, General Jackson died the next day. And I just find it very interesting and very speaks volumes of the man that on his deathbed, literally, he sent his friend away, someone who I'm sure he would have loved to have by his bedside to continue to pray with and to just have the company to pass the time. But he sent him away to look after his men. And, of course, I think there's a story of General Lee going up to Reverend Lacey afterwards asking how General Jackson was. And I can't remember the go-between between them, but again, that shows you how much each man cared for each other. But again, I am reading The Great Partnership, so it might be a bit biased. But that's a story I just heard, last Monday when I opened the book and started reading it. And it just fascinated me. And I couldn't get out of my head for a whole week. You know, I read it a couple days for his birthday, and on his birthday, I just could not get it out of my head. And so I went out and posted it. And it's just
so do you know what Lacey's text was that day?
I do not, actually.
He was preaching from Romans chapter 8. And there's a part of the passage in Romans chapter 8 says, all things work together for good to those that love God. And Lacey actually said that was one of Jackson's favorite passages or verses. All things work together for good or for good to those that love God. That was, there are services on that day. Of course, Jackson dies on May 10th. It's a Sunday, and there are services going on all over the Army, not just the one that Lacey leads or not just the one that Jones leads, but there are, many services and a lot of people there praying for Jackson. And of course, Lee says that too. And to continue your story just a little bit, that meeting between Lee and Lacey, and Lee asked about Jackson's condition and was told that Jackson would probably not live through the day. And Lee exclaimed, "Oh, sir, he must not die. Surely God will not visit us with such a calamity. If I have ever prayed in my life, I have pleaded with the Lord that Jackson might be spared." And then his heart swelled with emotion too deep for utterance, and Lee turned away and wept like a child. The following Sunday, there are let's just stay on May 10th for just a minute. There are other services. Francis Kennedy, who is chaplain of the 28th North Carolina, preached on May 10th and on May 17th. And on May 10th, Kennedy selected Psalms 103.2, which says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits." And then on the following Sunday, May 17th, he used Ecclesiastes 8:11 because he preaches from Ecclesiastes 8:11, and so just it's amazing. It would be a great study. This might make a great blog post to look at all of these different chaplains and see what their text was, and to go from there. And I saw a question in the chat.
We got a couple.
I know.
Let's see if I can pull a couple up real quick.
Scrolled up, and so David Pope asked about the two schools of thought on what killed Jackson, and I'm kind of there with the pneumonia. Jackson, on the night he was wounded, he was wearing a rubber coat, and it wasn't all that cold. It was not raining. It is May. It is spring, but it's very dry. It's not very wet. And so obviously there was now, of course, Jackson's a little weird with a lot of things. He would ride around with one finger up in the air or his hand up in the air because he thought it would improve his balance. And then that mini ball or that round ball at Manassas that shot part of his finger off kind of, dispelled him of that. But he would still, like I said, he couldn't ride very well. I can't say he didn't ride very well. He was not a very graceful rider. But it's probably pneumonia more than anything. I mean, he just, something's going on there, health wise, that causes him to put on that rubber coat, the rain slicker, and because there's no rain. So he's obviously not feeling well at that point in time. But it's one of those questions we'll probably never really know the answer to. That's just, I've seen a lot of people go back and forth. When you have a dozen different biographies on Jackson, everybody's got their own theory out there. Let's
see. Yeah, no, I know a lot of people who have theories, and some people will get very offended if you disagree with them on it.
I sure know, and I probably upset some people about Jackson taking that drink. But I'm just telling you what the people who lived with him said. Okay, I'm just telling you what those people said. Don't shoot the messenger. Just take it up with Douglas and some of his other staff officers. Did Jackson eat sauerkraut and onions known to prevent scurvy? Given his no, probably not. Jackson didn't eat a whole lot, period. But being a general, a high-ranking Confederate officer, he had people send him food all the time, like the lemon stories that I've told. So I don't think scurvy would have necessarily been. And you also have to look at the stages of the war. Food is okay in the winter of 61, 62. 62, 63, it's a little rougher until the fish start running in the rivers, the Rappahannock and the Rapidan. They're a little bit on the hungry side. The Confederate soldier in general, the Army of Northern Virginia. But it is Lee and it is Jackson, and people are bringing them food all the time. So I'm sure that scurvy on that level, that doesn't really become that big of an issue till we get that winter of 64, 65.
Let's see here.
So Are there any original copies of the Stonewall Jackson book around? I'm sure there are. I have a reprint of Cook's book, both on Lee and Jackson. You can get Dabney's book has been reprinted several times. I know this is David Pope's favorite book. Bud Robertson's is my favorite biography on him. But this originally came out in 1865. And Lee actually, Robert E. Lee actually had a copy of this, but didn't really get a whole lot of time to examine it. And once it really came out in print, he disagreed with a couple of Dabney's conclusions, especially about Chancellorsville. But you can pick this book up as a reprint. I'm sure you can get the original. Boy, it'd be great to have one with a from the New York publisher. But hey, if you got the money, it can be found. Let's see. There was one in here about Lee visiting Jackson's grave. You know, Lee, after the war was over and he moved to Lexington. This is from Justin Cruz. He moved to Lexington and became president of Washington College. Lee would take rides on Traveler many days every week, and there are stories of him going by Jackson's grave and just riding all over the countryside. That was kind of his way to get away and refresh and think and probably pray and just kind of reconnect with everything. Lee didn't talk a whole lot about the war for the first couple of years after he moved to Lexington. And it wasn't really until the last couple of years of his life that he decided he was going to write a history of the war or his memoirs like Davis did or Grant or Sherman did. But he never finished it. So I'd be interested to see how Lee's book would have turned out. He edited and worked on his dad's memoirs, and they are as dry as dirt. They really are. So I would love to have Lee's thoughts about the war. That would be awesome.
100%.
But, you know, not everybody can have Mark Twain as a literary editor. I don't know. John asked just below Justin Cruz's question about, or not asked, but stated that Jackson ran a Sunday school for Black slave children and adults in Lexington. And he did. He continued to support that school even after he went off to the war. He financially supported that school. And Jackson was a slave owner. His wife had been given 3 slaves, but there were a couple of other occasions where Jackson, there was a man, let's see if I can find his name real quick. There was a man by the name of Albert. His name was Albert, and Albert actually asked Jackson to purchase him, and in doing so, Albert wanted to work for his freedom, and Jackson agreed to that. Albert worked as a waiter at a hotel in Lexington and was then rented to VMI. And there's a lady by the name of Amy who was the family cook and housekeeper. She also asked Jackson to purchase her. So that's kind of an unusual story there. And there, I think there was a book out several years ago, not one that I have on Jackson, that talks about his Black Sunday school class. But that's not one of the books that I have.
I think we got a couple more questions. Let's see here. Oh, Victor Smith.
Victor, that's a great question. And I'm surprised so far nobody has, at least I've not seen it, has posted, if Jackson would have been at Gettysburg, then that battle would have totally turned out differently. I see that all the time. And you have to step back and look at it from what we know about Jackson. So Jackson, during the 7 days at White Oak Swamp, was given an order to go across the swamp, cut off the Federal retreat. And Jackson was tired, and Jackson got off his horse and took a nap, and the Federals escaped. And so maybe when Jackson gets to Gettysburg, he's tired and he gets off his horse and he takes a nap, and the Federals dig in, and it doesn't change the outcome of the battle. Or maybe Jackson is so far north, up around Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania, or someplace up in there, that Jackson doesn't show up at Gettysburg until July 2nd or July 3rd or July 4th. We can't answer that question about, those types of what if questions. Jackson, based upon what he did do when he is given somewhat independent command, or he's in charge, the Valley Campaign, Second Manassas, or Chancellorsville, he is phenomenal. Jackson is phenomenal. When Jackson is fighting at 7 Days or at Sharpsburg, he's kind of lost in the equation. Outside of Jackson, independent command, capturing Harper's Ferry, we don't talk about Jackson at Sharpsburg. He's just kind of lost in the muddle of history there of that battle and what's going on. Now we know Jackson is on the left over around the Dunkard Church, but his story, he's not out doing phenomenal things like he is at Second Manassas and Chancellorsville. So with Jackson, Victor, it's really hard to know what Jackson is going to show up. The war changes after Gettysburg, changes drastically after Gettysburg. We get, we accomplish Lee's greatest fear. We are locked into a siege around Petersburg and Richmond. And as Lee said, it was just a matter of time. And we talk about Lee at Petersburg and Richmond in 64 and 65. We don't hardly ever talk about Longstreet or A.P. Hill or Ewell or Anderson, the other corps commanders, because it's a different war. It really is. Let's
see if we have any more. Keep asking questions, everybody. We still have a bit of time if you want to. We can answer a couple more. Oh, we have something here.
Is Wheeler's book, We Knew Stonewall Jackson, a good book to read? Josh, it is just accounts and letters by people who knew Jackson, who saw Jackson. So if you're into that type of story about the war, sure, it's a great book. In fact, I pulled a bunch of Jackson stuff off. I actually have 14 Jackson books sitting here in front of me or to my right. But that's not actually one that I pulled off the shelf. It was not on the Jackson shelf. But I don't know if there's necessarily a bad book on Jackson. We all have our preferences. Probably the first one I ever read was they called him Stonewall by Burke Davis, which, if you want a smaller book, even though it's still almost 400, it is 400 pages. This is a great book, easy to read, simple to read, but you can get as detailed or as minute as there's a Stonewall Jackson day-by-day book. There's a Clint Johnson did a Looking for Stonewall Jackson, where he actually, goes to a lot of the places where Jackson lived or worked or fought during the war. So, there are all levels and different types of Stonewall Jackson books out there. Yeah, I mean, We Knew Stonewall Jackson is not a traditional biography on Jackson, like Dabney's book or like Bud Robertson's book. But yeah, it's good.
Ooh, we got 2 more pop up, or 3 more. Let's see here.
What was Jackson's greatest failure? Wow, what a good question. He was a terrible teacher. And then Jackson had a problem working well with others. We'll just say that way. Look at how many of the high-ranking officers under Jackson that Jackson had arrested at some point. The famous story about A.P. Hill, and it wasn't even Hill's fault, but Hill and Jackson had already clashed a little bit. And then, Hill had marching orders, and then Jackson changed the orders, but didn't tell Hill, and Jackson rides up and wants to know why Hill's not moving. And, Hill basically takes his sword and tries to give it to Jackson and say, okay, I quit. And Jackson places him under arrest. Jackson has a problem working well with the others. There are a lot of times, I discovered this in some of the research that I've done. We kind of want to idolize Jackson, and we believe our ancestors idolized Jackson, and later in life they probably did. But I have read many accounts where men hated to be under Jackson's command, because Jackson marched hard and he fought hard, and he had you up at early dawn, and you were on the road marching, and you were tired. You accomplished fantastic things, amazing things. But William Dorsey Pender said something, and I paraphrase, but William Dorsey Pender said that there's no general who will use up an army like Stonewall Jackson. So I think that inability sometimes to work well with others may have been Jackson's greatest failure. If Jackson would have just better communicated orders to Hill and his other division commanders, then AP Hill probably wouldn't have been arrested, and it was totally Jackson's fault. So I think that's what I would put as Jackson's greatest failure.
All right. We got, I think, a couple more. Let's see.
Okay.
Here.
So yes, Jackson was a artillery officer. After he graduated from West Point, he was assigned to a artillery battery in the United States Army. I don't know if I don't have the actual battery. I think it may have been the 2nd United States Artillery. We'll have to look that up. But he was ordered to Texas and then Mexico, and fought at Veracruz and Mexico City. He actually earned 3 brevets just in the Mexican War. And those are like, he was a lieutenant, and he was breveted first lieutenant and then captain and then major. Didn't mean he advanced in rank. That was just like an honorary thing that they did. You didn't really get medals or anything for being heroic in combat, like during the Mexican War. You got brevets, and he was breveted 3 different times. Jackson actually commanded a section of artillery when they executed John Brown after Brown raids Harper's Ferry. I can't recall. I have to go back and look. I can't recall any story where Jackson during the war took command of artillery like Longstreet did at Sharpsburg after the sunken road had been compromised, and the Confederates had retreated out of there. And Longstreet found a battery, and he himself didn't get down and work the guns, but he directed some of his staff officers on artillery fire. I don't recall, and maybe one of our listeners will, but I don't recall Jackson ever being that hands-on with artillery in the 1860s. But I mean, it's possible, absolutely possible.
You spoke about Longstreet, and it's so funny. The next question has to do with Longstreet.
Yeah.
Why do you think Jackson is more liked than Longstreet?
Because Jackson was a fantastic tactician, and Longstreet was not. Now, Longstreet's a solid officer. I'm not speaking bad about Longstreet. Longstreet is a fantastic officer. He's solid. He's capable. But if you look at Longstreet when he exercises independent command, down Knoxville, or when he's over on the coast, Suffolk, Virginia, in that area. Those are not shining moments in Longstreet's cheat sheet for command. I mean, cheat sheet for command. He's not. Nobody talks about Longstreet in that way. We talk about Jackson. Jackson is a fabulous tactician. We talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest is a fabulous tactician. Longstreet's just solid. And that's part of the reason. The other part of the reason is Longstreet changed sides after the war. He became a Republican and got a job and survived. And I think some folks would have resentment toward Longstreet about that. And that conversation goes on a lot deeper. Of course, Jackson is killed and becomes a Southern martyr and a Southern hero. And Longstreet survives the war and goes on to wage the war in print after the war is over. I think some things Longstreet did after the war took him down a couple of notches in that Southern pantheon of heroes.
We have Dr. Samuel Mitchum in the chat. Good to see you, Dr. Mitchum, our other historian here on the chat. He like yourself, Mr. Hardy, has to leave the trivia nights because y'all have won probably the most trivia nights.
I don't play. I mean, I sit here and I listen to it, but I'm like, and y'all do come up with questions that I'm like, I've never thought about that before. And then sometimes I'm like, well, I just should submit questions to y'all, but I just sit here and listen.
All right. Last question. Now, this one's interesting because I feel like we ask this, or we at least think it sometimes about a lot of our ancestors and heroes. But Justin asked, would Jackson want to be memorialized? We consider him a hero, but did he consider himself one?
No, not at all. Lee didn't want to be memorialized either. He actually said that. Lee actually said that. He was against monuments and things. And I think Jackson would have been even further against that than Lee. Remember that, many of the letters that Jackson signed, he felt that the outcome of a battle or what was going on was all divine providence. Even his death was divine providence. That is what God wanted. It was his time, and that's what God wanted. And so I think Jackson would have partially been, is horrified too big of a word? No, I mean, he would have been totally against it.
Hated it.
He would have hated it, just absolutely hated it, because, or maybe even embarrassed, but the credit Jackson said is not his. The glory is not his. The glory is God's.
Mm.
That's how Jackson believed. And you can get that in the letters that Jackson wrote to Mary and his official reports and all of that. That's Jackson. The praise is not mine. The praise goes to God and the men under me who did marvelous things. But it's really, really the praise goes to God. So yeah, but that's a fantastic question.
Oh yeah, I liked it because I think someone showed me that General Lee quote you're talking about a couple of years ago. I remember seeing it the first time, but I believe that's a good stopping point. I think that was a great question to stop on. I would like to ask everybody to thank Mr. Hardy for coming on. Phenomenal historian, does great works. He has to deal with me on a constant basis, which is not easy to do. So let's thank him for that.
That's not a problem.
He also gets all my book questions, considering I am writing my first history book And God bless him. God bless him. It'll be like random questions too, and he answers them pretty well.
The random ones are fun. As long as I don't have to do a lot of research for you, I'm okay. As long as I can point you to somebody else's book and say, well, you should really check this out. Or, look at pages 100 to 160 of this book, and you might find your answer right in there. And yeah, we can do that.
Well, I ask that everybody please go support Mr. Hardy at www.michaelchardy.com, www.michaelchardy.blogspot.com.
That's actually my Looking for the Confederate War blog. It's been going on for like 15 or 16 years. It is like the only Confederate blog out there. So go check it out. I've been on this Memphis, Tennessee kick the past couple of months because, there's hardly anything on Memphis in the war. And so I've been writing a lot of posts about Memphis, Tennessee. I did sneak one up this morning that I talked about last night on my live chat program about did Robert E. Lee read Edgar Allan Poe, which that was a lot of fun. But we're going to get back to the Memphis story here soon.
I feel like I think I watched one of your Sunday Night Lives and you were talking about that. And I was like, what a question I've never asked, but never more wanted the answer to.
What happens when you spend too much time on the road driving all over creation? You have a lot of time to think.
I get so many random thoughts to pop in my head when I'm driving to an SCV, either to speak or to attend. It's like it's so random. Dr. Mitchum, I'm writing a biography about Dr. McCain. I actually got asked to do that. It started off with me writing basically something to go in the Confederate Veteran. That's not where it was going to go, but that's something similar where it would be at home. And then someone basically looked at me and said, so you're writing a book. And it was late. I was tired. And I looked at them and said, yes. And then the next day they gave me a bunch of research. And I was like, well, I'm writing a book, I guess. And I've enjoyed it ever since. I have no idea when that will come out. But please go support Mr. Hardy. And make sure I see you this Thursday at Look Around the Confederation, 7 p.m. Confederate Standard Time. We will have past Commander-in-Chief Chuck McMichael on to talk about his platform for Army of Trans-Mississippi Councilmen. National elections are coming up, so a couple of Look Around episodes will be dedicated to the national officers that are the people that are running for national offices. We will start off with ATM, Councilman, Commander, and then that's how the process will follow. Councilman, Commander, Councilman, Commander, Councilman, Commander. If there's more than one person running for a position, I'm going to flip a coin on who gets to go first. Just randomly flip a coin. And it will just be that. And you'll have the whole hour dedicated to yourself to sit back, tell everybody who you are, your SCV career, your platform, and just let people get to know you. We have a lot of great people running. So I cannot wait to hear from all of them. But this Thursday, we'll have past Commander-in-Chief Chuck McMichael on. So make sure you're there for that. And make sure to share this episode. We had a great crowd tonight. Y'all asked some great questions. And I think Mr. Hardy did a phenomenal job. So let's share off this great episode. Let's have a big episode for Jackson. Last week's Lee Jackson episode got double what we normally get for an episode. We are currently at 2,250 views for that episode. That is crazy, and we cannot thank y'all enough for that. So keep it up, keep sharing, keep being great chat heads, keep fighting and reclaiming the narrative 1 week at a time. So without further ado, Mr. Hardy, do you have anything you want to say before we go off the air?
Hey, come see me in Asheville on Thursday night. If you're not, then check out Look Around the Confederation.
Well, I hope they come see you because it will be well, actually, no, for once I'm not alone. So, yeah, I actually have a guest for once. I'm so used to it just being me, I almost bashed the episode out of instinct. No. Support each one if you can. Oh, man, it's been a Monday. All right, well, thank you all for watching. And I will see you guys Thursday. And remember, my friends, no Fumar in the elevator. Good night, everybody.